underway. All right, welcome everybody to Café Sci. This is April 2021, and my name is Brad Peroni. I'll be your host this evening, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Sheridan from Carnegie Museum of Natural History. Now, we have a bio here. Jennifer Sheridan is the assistant curator for the section of amphibians and reptiles at Carnegie Museum of Natural History. Jennifer's a tropical conservation ecologist, and her research interests are ecological responses to changes in both climate and habitat and land use. She utilizes frogs as study organisms, but with an eye for how they fit into the ecosystem as a whole. The main goals of her research are to understand and quantify threats to biodiversity in order to better focus conservation efforts and mitigate change. To those ends, Jennifer currently examines the effects of habitat alteration on amphibian communities, the effect of climate change on organism size, and anthropogenic impacts on organisms in urban areas. Understanding how species are separated in ecological space and how species are affected by changes in their environment allow for better predictions of biodiversity losses and potential mitigation techniques. The majority of her research has been in Southeast Asia, but Jennifer also examines impacts of climate change and land use on amphibians in Pennsylvania, utilizing Carnegie Museum of Natural History's collections, along with fieldwork at Powder Mill Research Station. And I'd also like to thank Jennifer in advance for joining us tonight, and I would also like to thank our sponsors. Café Sci is sponsored by PPG and presented by Cook Myosite, and not to sound too cheesy, but by good people like you out there, folks who come to Café Sci, whether it's online or on site at the Science Center as it had been in the past. We really couldn't do this without your support. If you're interested in supporting Café Sci, obviously a monetary contribution is much appreciated, but one of the best things you can do to help Café Sci is to share it with your friends and invite family, co-workers, acquaintances, your letter carrier, anyone you meet to join us here for the next iteration of Café Sci, the first Monday of each month. And with that, I will turn things over to Jennifer. Welcome. Thank you for joining us in Café Sci. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. So thank you, Brad, for inviting me to be part of Café Sci and to speak to all of you today about my research. So I am going to be talking, I'm realizing my title on this slide is very slightly different than the one that I gave Brad, which is Frogs, Who Are They and Why Should You Care? So I'm going to talk a lot about frogs, which is the main thing that I study. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how I personally became a herpetologist and an ecologist. And then I'll talk about sort of three main areas of my research, and I'm just going to talk about each one for 5 to 10 minutes each. And if at any time you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A, I believe, and Brad is going to throw those questions at me as they come in, or save a few of them for the end. So I'm more than happy to expand on anything that I'm talking about today and answer any other questions that you have. So I myself am let's see if I can get this, herpetologist. And when I say this to people on the street, sometimes they think what that means is that I study the herpes virus, and that is not true. So hopefully everybody here knows, if you're a Café Sci attendee, you probably have an interest in science. So you hopefully know that the word herpetologist means someone who studies amphibians and reptiles. And that's exactly what I do. And I personally became a herpetologist a little bit later in life. So my background is that I didn't really grow up searching for or playing with or owning amphibians and reptiles the way many other herpetologists do. When I was very young, I lived in Detroit. This green star shows where in Detroit I lived. And this is a current Google image of the house that I grew up in. And so you can see it's not too dissimilar from some parts of Pittsburgh. It's, fairly kind of like urban/suburban. And the closest I ever got to nature as a little kid was going to a fish farm once a summer with my dad and my brothers. So again, this is really different from a lot of other herpetologists who, like I said, they grow up kind of like hunting for, searching for, playing with, owning amphibians and reptiles. And I came to it much later in life. So when I was in college, I had a TA for an ecology class who had a project on amphibians in the forest preserves around the city of Chicago, where I was in school. And she hired me to help her with her research one spring, the spring and summer of after my third year. And this is what is on the screen now. It's called a minnow trap. We would put these minnow traps out in these ponds. We would go back the next day, open them up. These are blue spotted salamanders. You can see they're full of blue spotted salamanders, and they'd be full of sometimes big giant tadpoles. And I remember being out there wearing waders, thigh deep in this pond water, and just thinking to myself, I can't believe I'm getting paid to play with animals. So as a kid, you know, I had watched these nature shows, which at the time were things like Wild Kingdom, and I was fascinated by animals. But this was really the first experience that I had of being up close and personal with nature. And then after I finished college, that same TA hired me to be her field assistant in Borneo. And I was in the field with her for 6 months. And it was the greatest 6 months of my life. I remember as a kid, like I said, watching these nature shows and hearing that in the tropical rainforest, there were millions of species. And as a kid from Detroit, I just thought, no way, that's not possible. There's no possible way. There's a million things out there. I just thought scientists were splitting hairs and that there was no way there could be a million different things. And I went to the tropical rainforest, and almost as soon as I got there, I remember looking around and thinking, I get it now. So it was very, very eye-opening for me and very crucial to my sort of development as a scientist and my interest in tropical ecology and tropical conservation, because I was able to see firsthand how much diversity is there. Like every single tree and plant and leaf that you see is unique and different. There's so many species packed into that space, and it really had a big impact on me. And that project was also on frogs. And that really sort of solidified my love of frogs for a number of reasons. So first of all, frogs are adorable. I mean, look how cute this is. This is a tree frog from Borneo. And one of the main things that I say about why I like working with frogs, which sounds like a joke, but it's not, is that frogs don't bite. So if you work with mammals, you're probably going to get bitten. I actually worked on birds for my master's degree, and I got bitten every single day, and it was so unpleasant, and I hated those birds. And even though some frogs do have fangs, this is a species from Southeast Asia in the genus Limnonectes. They're called the fanged frogs. The males have these long fangs, and they use them to attract females, but they don't actually use them to bite. So when you're handling frogs, you're never really going to get bitten, and that makes them very pleasant to work with. And that is not a small matter when you are handling lots of individuals and trying to answer lots of interesting ecological questions. Secondly, one of the reasons I love frogs is because they're incredibly diverse. So all of these are frogs from Borneo, and there are only a few examples of the frogs from Borneo. There's over 150 species of frogs on the island of Borneo. When I'm out on any given night, I will see probably 10 to 25 species, but in the course of a few months, I'll see about 50 species in one area, and it's just really incredible diversity out there. And frogs live on every continent except Antarctica, and they have really incredible adaptations. So for example, this is a wood frog in the upper left here, and this wood frog occurs across all of most of North America. They have this huge geographic range of more than 9 million square kilometers from Alabama up north of the Arctic Circle, and they're kind of famous for being able to tolerate freezing. So they have a substance in their blood that acts basically as antifreeze, and so the blood keeps moving to their vital organs, and that allows them to keep their vital organs functioning even though they look outwardly frozen solid. Additionally, we know that that amphibians by and large are tied to water, and yet we find species of frogs even in in desert areas. So in areas that are really dry, you get frogs like the one on the lower right. What they do is they burrow down, they secrete kind of a cocoon around themselves, and that keeps their moisture in. It prevents that all the moisture of their body from escaping. And then rains come down whenever the rainy season comes, and it sort of lets them know it's time to hatch out, and they'll come up to the surface and go about their business. So all of this is to say, these are just two examples of the incredible adaptations that frogs have to different environments around the globe. And yet individually, every single species is very sensitive to changes in its own environment. So they have this really interesting ecology in, broadly speaking, being very well adapted to many different regions, but as an individual species being very, very sensitive to changes in their environment. The other thing I like about frogs is that they have incredible variety in terms of their ecology. So some frogs have parental care, like this little guy protecting his eggs. Very interestingly, there's a lot of examples of male parental care in frogs. And they also have really varied reproductive systems. So normally frogs have external fertilization, similar to fish. So a female will lay the eggs, a male will fertilize those eggs, and then those eggs develop. There's some examples though in frogs of internal fertilization. And there's even examples like this crazy one. This is called a gastric brooding frog. What happens is the female lays eggs, the male fertilizes them, and then the female eats them, but she doesn't digest them. She puts them into what's called a gastric brooding pouch, and the frogs develop inside there, and then weeks later the froglets basically hop out of her mouth, which is incredible. So parental care, you have things like gastric brooding, you have examples of internal fertilization, which are very rare for again, amphibians or reptiles. And so it's really, really interesting. And also there's some examples where even females will call to males. So this is a species in Southeast Asia where the males have parental care, and there's evidence that shows that these females are the ones that are doing the calling. So normally in frogs, it's just the males that do all the calling and all the hard work. But in this case, we see this sort of sex reversal. Another thing that I really love is something that I've been working on in the last year is the fact that these frogs are so abundant. So I've been working on looking at how dense these frog individuals are in areas where they occur, meaning how many individuals do you get per unit area? And what I found in scouring the literature is that in different parts of the world, you get anywhere from about 56,000 individuals per square kilometer on average in parts of Africa to more than 353,000 individuals per square kilometer on average in North America. The maximum I've seen in any paper so far was from Shenandoah National Forest in Virginia that reported almost 13 million individuals per square kilometer, which blew my mind when I read this. So I'm working on this paper that's kind of like summarizing the density of these individuals. And this is really interesting ecologically because it means that, one, it's easy for students and other people to study frogs because we can easily find them. And also we know then that this also translates into what we call biomass, or how much mass is there, how much do these things weigh? And the reason that scientists care about how much biomass is at a given trophic level or a given area is because then that allows us to examine quantitatively how the different trophic levels interact. So if you were to lose all of the amphibians because of something like chytrid fungus or climate change, you would be able to quantify then the impact on the other parts of the ecosystem if you know how much biomass that amphibian level represents. And the preliminary estimates of biomass of frog or amphibians, I should say, is anywhere from 165 to over 1,000 kilograms per square kilometer. And there are some studies that suggest that amphibians actually make up the majority of vertebrate biomass in any system in which they occur, which means that if you total up all of the weight of all of the amphibians, it's more than the reptiles, it's more than the birds, and it's more than the mammals in some cases. So that means that they have a really big impact on the ecosystem. So we want to know what's happening to those frogs and other amphibians because it matters for the rest of the ecosystem. The other thing is that frogs are extremely diverse. So you may know that there's 3 types of amphibians out there. There's these limbless amphibians called caecilians. There's about 200 species of those. We have salamanders, like we talked about earlier in the sort of introductory banter. Salamanders, the center of diversity is actually in North Carolina. And overall, there's about 700 species of salamanders on the planet. But with frogs, there are more than 7,000 species of frogs. So all of this is to say that while amphibians in general are very diverse, the frogs are the most diverse. And because of this, because they're really diverse, then that gives us opportunities to answer lots of interesting evolutionary questions as well as ecological questions. The other thing that I love about frogs is that they're very accessible. So as I mentioned, they don't bite. And this means that I can get students to engage with frogs in a very real, tangible way. And that helps students to engage with animals and nature more generally. So I used to work at a small liberal arts college in Singapore called Yale NUS. And on the left here is one of my students. I don't know if you can see the little frog that he's staring at on that stem. But he did a project looking at the impacts of traffic noise on the call of this little species. So for part of the conservation class that I was teaching, I took the students over to my field site in Borneo for a week, and everyone conducted a little experiment or project. And he had recorded traffic noise in Singapore, and then he played it back to the frog, and he looked at how that call changed in response to that traffic noise. And what we found was that the frog adjusted its call in a way that was very energetically expensive, which suggests that traffic noise will have a very negative impact on the energetics and thus the physiology of this particular species. Brad, do you have a question for me?
We have a question that came in, Jen. So this question is from Kitty Mama, and I think it goes back to some of the adaptations you were talking about, and the fact that there's so much, amphibian biomass, but there's no amphibians in Antarctica. So if frogs have these antifreeze proteins, why are they not found in Antarctica?
That's a good question. My guess would be that it has to do with where frogs evolved and the placement of the continents at the time that they were diversifying. So as an ecologist, I am not an expert in sort of the evolutionary history of frog diversity over time, over geologic time anyway. But that would be my guess, is that where frogs first arose and diversified, they weren't sort of diversifying on what became the continent of Antarctica when it sort of, I guess, I don't even know geology well enough to know like when Antarctica separated from the rest of the Pangea, I guess. So that would be my guess, and that if things had gone differently, that it's possible that we would have them there. I would also have to look at when wood frogs arose, meaning how old they are and when they were first then exposed to freezing environments. My guess is that it would be a lot more recent than the separation of the continents from the other continents from Antarctica. That's a great question. So as I said, I really love getting students into the field and getting students to handle frogs, because I think when you have that tangible connection, when you're able to handle an organism in a safe way, it really does allow you to form sort of an emotional and a mental connection with nature more broadly. So the student on the right, this is the first time she ever held a frog, and I love the face that she's making here, because it just shows this kind of like joy that people get when they really make this connection with a wild animal. And I like to say then, because frogs are so easy to find and they're safe to handle, and I can teach students how to handle them safely without injury to the frog or the student, that frogs are basically like a gateway drug to the rest of nature. It's a way to hook students in and get them really, really interested in studying wildlife more broadly. Sorry, I'm like losing myself a little bit. So this is how I came to be an ecologist and a herpetologist, and why I love frogs so much, and why they're really great for answering so many cool questions. And I'm going to talk about a few of the main areas of my research now. As Brad mentioned, I'm a tropical conservation ecologist, and what that means is I work in areas like this. This is a picture of one of my field sites. This is a stream that I work on regularly in Sabah, part of Borneo, part of Malaysian Borneo, where I work. And I work in settings like this because I am passionate about conservation, and I want my work to impact conservation. So by working in tropical rainforests, I know that any of the results that I get are going to have big impacts for conservation. And I study frogs, as I said, for the reasons that I've articulated, and I work on three main things. So first, I look at species delimitation, or defining species. I work on ecological impacts of climate change, mostly using museum specimens. And I also look at the impacts of habitat fragmentation. So like I said, I'm going to touch on each of these briefly. And please feel free to throw questions at me or ask questions at the end, either way. Okay, so excuse me. So most of my work, as I said, is based in tropical Southeast Asia. This is me in the field in Laos, making collections. I think everybody here probably knows that in order to conserve species, we first have to understand what species we have, meaning how many species are there in a given area of interest. And I've long been driven by questions of how organisms respond to habitat or climate change. And in order to answer such questions, we have to be sure that we understand what species occur where. So as an ecologist and as a conservation biologist, the fundamental unit of both of these fields is the species. So ecologists examine how organisms relate to one another, either within a species, population ecology, or across species, community ecology. And excuse me, while there's many different approaches one could take to conservation, the majority of conservation projects really do focus at the individual species level. So I'm sure everybody here has seen things like save the rhino, save the orangutans, let's save the panda. And even though we know that, again, there's lots of different ways that we can approach conservation, the Nature Conservancy, for example, takes the approach of just preserving lots of habitat. But by and large, conservation is driven by understanding individual species. And one thing that's exciting for me is that in Southeast Asia, as with many parts of the tropics, there's lots of new species being discovered all the time. I think this is exciting to point out to students because I think when you're young and you're getting into science, it can feel like we already know everything. But it's exciting to me to be able to share with students that actually there's lots of undescribed species, especially in places like Southeast Asia. So this is the rate of new species discovery. This chart is now a little bit outdated, but from the 1980s through about 2010. And what you see here is that every year there's new species being described. This is just amphibians and reptiles. I think it's actually just amphibians. And so as part of my postdoc, my last postdoc that I had, I worked at a museum in North Carolina, the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. And the main project that I worked on was what we call a taxonomic revision. So a taxonomic revision is where you take a species that is defined and you basically look to see, okay, is it one species or is it multiple species? So my advisor and I worked on what is called Hylarana nigrivitata. It's just a ronid, kind of like common frog from across Southeast Asia. So all these black dots are this species. This species was over time repeatedly sort of lumped together with and then split from another species represented by the blue squares called Hylarana mortensini. And sometimes into this group was thrown another species called Hylarana faber, which is these orange triangles that are sort of hidden there. So lots of studies had kind of suggested that actually we think there's more than just these three species out there, but nobody had fully kind of tackled it systematically to look at what the actual diversity was in this group. So my advisor and I decided to look at this using the common methods, which were genetics and also morphology. So when I did this project, I think we examined we sequenced 350 individuals from 134 locations in 6 countries, and I measured 385 adult specimens. And what we found was that there were actually 5 previously undescribed species in this species group. And this has implications for conservation because, as you can imagine, if you think that your species distribution maps look like this, then you would say, well, any couple of those black dots, we can probably lose that habitat because there's lots of other areas where those black dots occur. But if you take the current and correct species distribution maps, then what you can see is that these orange triangles, sideways triangles, or these white diamonds, for example, those species have actually very small geographic ranges. And so this new species description really highlights that some of these species that we thought were very widespread are actually made up of lots of species, some of which are still widespread, and we still have block dots spanning quite a big geographic range. But hidden within there, we're going to have some species that have much, much smaller geographic ranges, which means that those ones with much smaller geographic ranges are going to be more likely to be threatened or endangered. So species description is really important for conservation so that we can understand what we have and how best to preserve it. And another thing I like to point out with this study is that, my work really, for that project, really relied heavily on museum specimens. So all of this was done using museum specimens. And like I said, it was from, the specimens came from more than 6 countries. And the specimens were held in numerous museums across the world. And we requested those specimens on loan. And I was able to examine them. And so this is a really nice thing for me to be able to talk about when people ask, well, why do we need to have so many different things in collections? It's so that we can do some of this basic science that's still really important. We don't think about it too much here in North America because North America has been very well studied, but there's still large parts of the globe that need further work on species delimitation. And I like to make regular voucher collections of specimens because only by having these regular collections can we really start to understand how disturbances such as fragmentation or climate change impact organisms. And that leads me to the second area of my work, which is the impacts of climate change. So we know that the Earth is warming and we know that precipitation patterns are changing. We also know that there's a lot of changes happening in phenology, which means that plants are flowering earlier and animals are breeding earlier. There's evidence showing that organisms are shifting their ranges, either to track a thermal niche or to follow a food resource. And more recently, we've seen that actually body sizes are also changing. And in general, organisms are getting smaller with climate change. And there's a lot of reasons why we think or we know that organisms are getting smaller. There's lots of physiological principles that tell us that as climates warm, you should expect organisms to be smaller. But it's really hard to tease apart sort of the mechanisms for why that is. So one of these papers was written by myself and my first postdoc advisor, and we summarized sort of what was known at the time back in 2011 of this field. There had been lots of reports of size changes, and we looked at this to kind of review overall what we know was happening. And once scientists take that first step of kind of identifying a new trend, the next step is then to try to identify, well, why is that happening? So like we said, there's lots of different physiological reasons or theories as to why you would see this kind of shrinking of organisms, but it's really hard with something like climate change to get at the mechanisms. But with some colleagues at Alabama, where I was a postdoc at the time, we decided to try to get at these mechanisms by using the good old wood frog. And the wood frog, as I mentioned earlier, has this huge geographic range. And this makes it a really good study organism for getting at these mechanisms. And the way that we thought that we could do this was by taking individuals from museum collections looking at the ones that were georeferenced, meaning we knew exactly where they came from. And we decided to look at what were the predictors of size prior to the onset of climate warming. So we figured if we knew what predicted size before climate warming really kicked in, and that's right around 1960, then if we looked at how climate, we could use that to say, okay, can we then accurately predict what happened to size after 1960? So from 1960 to about the year 2000. So we measured individuals from about 1900 to the year 2000. We had several hundred, over 1,000 individuals in total. And I like to point out that even though I had no idea that I would ever work here, about a third of these individuals came from the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. So I requested a lot of these specimens on loan before I even applied for this job, years before it became available. So it sort of felt like coming full circle for me when I did get this job. So we looked to see whether we could predict how these individuals would respond. And if we could do that, then that would strongly suggest that the mechanism itself is whatever element of climate change that we were examining. So we found that for females, the best predictor of size was precipitation, and for males, the best predictor of size was the number of frost-free days. But what we didn't see was that, and we saw that both males and females were getting smaller over time, but that these traits did not accurately predict how the size changed exactly. And so what that tells us is that in this particular case with the wood frogs, it's not these individual climate traits that are predicting that change in size, which means we need to look for something else. So again, those mechanisms are really hard to get at because there's no easy, concise way to conduct a climate change experiment. There's so many other things that are changing simultaneously. So we still don't know, at least in the case of wood frogs, what is driving that size change. So to look at this another way, I wanted to look at this in a tropical area. So I used the frogs from Borneo, and I measured over 3,000 individuals from across Borneo for more than 126 years from 29 species sex groups. And so what we found was that frogs from Borneo are indeed getting smaller. And in the case of the Borneo frogs, that the size change is accurately predicted by a combination of temperature and precipitation. And then the interesting thing about this work, which is not yet published, is that the impact on females is 5 times greater than the impact on males. So this is, again, something it's kind of an emerging field. We're still kind of trying to understand how climate change is impacting organisms, especially with respect to size. There's some suggestion that males and females may be responding differently, and that in some cases we may know what the trend is, the driving mechanism is in the case of the Borneo frogs, but in the case of the wood frog, for example, we still don't know what the driving mechanism is. So that brings us to my last element of research, and hopefully everyone is still with me. And the last thing I want to talk about is how frogs respond to habitat fragmentation. So this map shows deforestation rates from 1990 to 2000, and you can see that lots of those deepest red colors are in the tropics. And more specifically, the rate of deforestation is highest in tropical Southeast Asia. So what that means is compared to the total amount of forest that's left, how much, is lost every year. And this nice green circle highlights the island of Borneo where I work and shows that that is the area in the globe that has the highest rate of deforestation in the world. So one way, and the thing that's driving this deforestation in tropical Southeast Asia, so again, we have primary forest here. The thing that drives this deforestation in Southeast Asia is oil palm plantation. So when I give a talk like this live, I usually ask people to raise their hand if they've ever heard of palm oil, and also raise your hand if you have consumed or used a product in the last week that contains palm oil. And what I can tell you is that usually about 8+ years ago when I started talking about this topic, it was often the case in the US that people hadn't heard of palm oil, but now a lot of people have. And it's it used to be less common for people to understand what products contain palm oil. So all of these products here contain palm oil. And so the likelihood is that all of us in the last week have consumed or used a product that contains palm oil. In the US, it is possible to find products, to choose options that don't have palm oil, partly because of subsidies for corn and soy. But in Europe and Asia, just about every processed food, every beauty product, every cleaning agent contains palm oil. And the use of palm oil is growing across the globe. And what that means is that we're going to be getting more and more landscapes that look like this. So you have this nice primary forest that's nice and diverse. It's got lots of diversity of plants, trees, and animals. And then you get converted to a monoculture and you lose upwards of 90% of the biodiversity in that area. And because the use of palm oil is expanding, then really the best way for us to conserve the diversity that exists in these primary forests is to partner together with oil palm companies in order to improve plantation design. And that's what this project does that I work under in Borneo, the Stability of Altered Forest Ecosystems project. So this is a big project that's a partnership between scientists, the government of Sabah, and the world's largest producer of palm oil, Sime Darby. It occurs here in Borneo, right about there, in the northern state of Sabah, which is part of Malaysia. This is a map of the study area, and it's meant to show these red outlines are riparian, or they're actually catchments of these streams, and these little labels next to them are meant to indicate the size of the riparian buffer left intact in this landscape. So when I started this project, I wanted to look at what was the relationship between diversity on these streams where most of the frogs in Southeast Asia breed and the size of that riparian buffer. So I wanted to know, as you increase that buffer size, meaning as you preserve more forest around those streams within a larger oil palm landscape, do you get a linear increase in diversity, or is it curvilinear? Do you see sort of an exponential growth? And the reason I wanted to look at that was so that then we could make recommendations for how oil palm plantations are designed, meaning what is the size of buffer left around streams that's going to maximize the preservation of biodiversity on those streams. And one thing I like to point out to people is that because this work takes place in the tropics, nothing ever really goes to plan. So this was my plan when I started this project back in 2011. And so, like I said, you get these beautiful streams and primary forest areas that look like this. You get frogs occurring on those streams, and you get tadpoles in those streams as well. But nothing really goes to plan. And so I started shifting how I was thinking about this question and started really thinking more about this relationship then between primary productivity and biodiversity. So primary productivity is how much energy is generated in a system, usually by things like plants that convert sunlight into energy that then other organisms consume. And by and large, over many decades, people have looked at this question at small and large scales, and we see that as you increase primary productivity, you get an increase in diversity. So this is one of the things that people say is why the tropics are so diverse, is because they have huge primary productivity. So what I wanted to know then was, well, does this basic ecological principle that there is a strong positive relationship between productivity and diversity, is that still true when we have fragmented landscapes? So as I said, the original plan was to look at the relationship between that buffer size and diversity. And because that project didn't sort of, the fragmentation didn't proceed as planned, but there were still differences in the primary productivity in those catchments, and there were differences in the diversity of frogs on those streams. And so I turned my focus to measuring productivity more directly, and there's two ways that we can do this. We can use remote sensing to look at what's called NDVI, which is a way to kind of look at how green an area is. So we can get at terrestrial productivity by measuring NDVI. And then because frogs live in both aquatic environments and terrestrial environments, I wanted to look at what the aquatic primary productivity was as well. And so I measured these two types of productivity, as well as abundance and diversity of frogs on several streams, both in primary and secondary forest. And the question is, do we see the same patterns in primary forest and secondary forest? So in primary forest, what we found was that the best predictor of both species diversity and abundance was not NDVI or terrestrial productivity, but it was actually the variation in aquatic primary productivity, meaning the stability of that productivity and the stability of the aquatic primary productivity specifically is the best predictor of diversity. So the less variation in aquatic productivity you have, the more diversity you have. And as I kind of suspected, that relationship does not hold in secondary forest. These graphs it doesn't make as big of an impact as I want it to, but if you run the fancy statistics of multivariate models, you would see that these numbers are really indicating that there's two very different patterns here. And this is a project that I am sending to NSF for funding. I'm hoping to then expand this to look at more areas of primary, secondary, and agricultural forest to look at this relationship between productivity and biodiversity. And the reason why I'm interested in whether this sort of long-held relationship between productivity and diversity still holds in fragmented habitats is because it turns out that currently about 74% of the Earth's surface is disturbed. And much of that disturbance has occurred in the last several decades. And so what that means is that these kind of basic ecological principles that we've always been taught and long held to be true, they may not actually be true in today's world, and they may not be true in the future. And so in addition to fragmentation, we know that we're experiencing climate change. We're going to continue experiencing climate change. So it's important for us to understand that relationship between diversity and productivity if we want to be able to predict the impacts of climate change, for example, on biodiversity. Because one of the ways that people predict the impacts of climate change on biodiversity is by looking at changes in NDVI and other measures of primary productivity, because it is assumed that that is linearly related to biodiversity. So this work is really exciting to me because I feel like it's sort of challenging some of these basic ecological principles that we've long held, and I'm hoping that NSF funds it so I can continue working in Southeast Asia, looking at this question more broadly across more spaces. And I'm just about done. I have this one more slide and then I'll have my thank you slide, and I apologize for taking so long. So these are the ways that I use frogs, including lots of museum specimens, to examine questions related to species delimitation, climate change, and habitat fragmentation. Thank you so much for your patience. I'm sorry that went longer than expected, but I would love to answer any questions that people have.
Well, we certainly have some questions, and I want to thank you right now because that was fascinating. I can attest that my wife in the other room there, she was just amazed at the diversity and all of the you know with 7,000 frogs plus, that's just
incredible, right?
yeah. So we do have some questions, and for those of you who might be pondering some questions and what to do with them, you can put them in the Q&A box. You'll find the Q&A button in the bottom of your Zoom window, so please don't hesitate. I promised Jen that the Q&A was always the most exhilarating part of Café Sci. So we have a few that have come in already. One
Can I
to
stop sharing, by the way?
Yeah, go for it. One that just came in a moment ago was how do you define primary and secondary forest? So if you can clarify that for us, that was a question from Paul.
Great. So primary forest is generally thought of as undisturbed forest, and this gets a lot of sort of debate on what that means, meaning it's fairly well known that most habitats on Earth have some kind of human presence and influence. In tropical Southeast Asia, what that means is that there actually is, in Sabah anyway, there's very low human population density in what is considered primary forest. So it's generally considered a forest that hasn't been commercially logged, and in many cases it hasn't even been selectively logged, except by I guess like small individuals. It basically hasn't been like logged for large scale commercial purposes. Secondary forest is areas that have been logged. So the SAFE project area is situated in a secondary forest area. If you were to go in there as someone who's never been in a rainforest before, you might think that it's pretty good rainforest. If you kind of know what you're looking for, you can see that there's plants and some species that are sort of associated with disturbance. So it's areas that have been selectively logged or previously clear cut and then grown back, which also happens in some parts of Central America and Costa Rica in particular. They've shown that if you sort of leave a place after logging it or cutting it down or clearing it, it actually comes back pretty nicely.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. So we had a few questions come up that I didn't want to bring up during the talk because I knew you were going to get to them. Clifford asked earlier in the talk about the threat from palm oil production, and I think we certainly heard a lot about that. But I will extend on Clifford's question just very quickly. If someone is concerned about the effects of palm oil on biodiversity, you know, like you said, here in the U.S., there are some consumer choices. Do you have any other resources or guidance for people who want to learn more about what options they have?
Yeah, mostly. So I personally choose to, and I've gone through phases of like being better at this and worse at this. I try not to consume products that have palm oil, partly because as a conservation biologist, I feel like I have to set an example for others, and I don't begrudge anyone their choices. We all make like trade-offs in life, and so that's fine. I will say that if you read labels, you can usually find an option for most things in the US that don't contain palm oil, at least food-wise. That being said, so like, for example, I don't eat Twizzlers anymore because they contain palm oil, but I eat Mike and Ike's because they don't contain palm oil. And so there's little things like that I just have to read the labels and figure out what to get. There should be, I should look this up because I probably should be have these resources more handy. But I know that there are several websites that you can look for that will kind of list products that you can choose that don't have palm oil in them. And then there's something called this Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil that you may or may not have heard of. It's kind of also it's unclear to me how they're defining sustainable. And so it's a little bit iffy. It's fairly popular in Southeast Asia and in the UK in particular. And there's lots of large grocery store chains in the UK that only buy products that are certified by the RSPO. But I feel like, from my perspective, I'm just going to try to choose, especially here in America, choose products that don't have palm oil. But that would be another resource you could go to if you're interested in choosing a more sustainable version of palm oil.
Great. So we have a question here from Bill, and I think this is one that a lot of people would be interested in. Do any frogs feed on other frogs?
Yes. Oh my God. I love that you asked that because I actually photographed it one time. And I wish I had that picture handy. I was in the field and I was at this pond in Danum, one of my field sites. And it was a tree frog feeding on a different species of tree frog. And I took a picture of it and I shared it with a couple of people, and it made it into the next version of the Frogs of Borneo book, which I was very proud of. And then I've actually had other friends that work in the field on other things take this, like basically the same picture, meaning witnessing the same frog on frog. It's not cannibalization because they're different species, but frogs eating other frogs. Other than that particular set of species, I don't know of many other than to say that frogs will basically eat whatever they can fit in their mouths. And so I don't think they're particularly picky. And so any frog that is going to be eating anything, they will eat things like snakes and birds and reptiles. And so it's possible that we just don't see a lot of examples of it, but I'm pretty sure it exists.
Yeah, I'm sure if they were big enough, they would have no qualms about trying to
exactly.
eat we have a comment here from Stephen. You made us love frogs too, so wonderful. Thank you for
Yay.
great comments like that. Um, let's see. We've got a question here about climate change. Two related
Mm.
questions about climate change. Kitty Mama asks, can you estimate the number of Southeast Asian frog species? Well, she says species. I might have assumed she meant frog species, but I'll say Southeast Asian species lost annually from climate change and
Mm.
habitat loss. And Virginia asks, a related question: is the effect of climate change on frogs in general more obvious in North America or Southeast Asia?
Ooh, so these are both great questions that I'm so excited to answer. So I'm going to go with the second one first, and please remind me what that first question was if I forget by the time I get to it. So the question of whether climate change has a bigger impact on frogs in North America or Southeast Asia. One thing that we know, which is really interesting and at first sort of seems counterintuitive, is that climate change is expected to have a much larger impact on tropical organisms versus temperate organisms. And when scientists first started thinking about climate change, this was sort of something that took people by surprise. But the reason is because organisms that live in North America, for example, we have a really large range of temperatures that most organisms experience. So, we just had a freeze the other day, and we have long winters. We have very cold, periods, and then we have very hot summers. And so these organisms that exist in North America and other temperate regions, they experience a wide range of temperatures anyway. Organisms that exist in the tropics, they usually have what's called a very small thermal niche, or a range of temperatures at which they can exist. And so any small change in the tropics is going to have a much bigger effect than the equivalent change in the temperate region. So my suspicion is that the climate change will have a much bigger effect in Southeast Asia and other areas of the tropics than it will on frogs in North America. The first question was, do we know of how many species are going extinct or have gone extinct due to either habitat fragmentation or climate change, specifically in Southeast Asia, I think was the question. The short answer is I personally do not. And this is I would have to look at the literature to see if anyone has estimated that, and when the last time somebody estimated that was. And the reason that I find that question to be really tricky is because, as we talked about, there's still a high rate of species discovery in Southeast Asia in particular. And so we can kind of estimate based on the rate of species discovery, where that's going to end, meaning how many species we're likely to encounter if given enough time. But it's really difficult to know when we're going to start to plateau with that. And so it would be really difficult to know. I can't think of any cases where climate change would have driven things extinct in Southeast Asia, but it is the case that habitat fragmentation is likely to have caused some amount of extinction, because, as we said, with the that sort of new species description, we're probably losing species that we haven't even detected yet, because we currently sort of assume that there's lots of these widespread species, and actually there's sort of hidden diversity in those widespread species. So I think that it's likely that we've lost species already, but how many, I couldn't even venture a guess. But that's a great question that I should look up to see if somebody has written a paper on that and estimated that.
Yeah, so many unknowns there. It's and like you were describing earlier with, a species complex that could actually be lots of individual species, that might be part of it and not just, a wholly new undiscovered species. So there's,
Mm-hmm.
that understanding can change a lot. And, I love the response about the first question and how counterintuitive it is to think about those
Mm-hmm.
bigger impacts of climate in the tropics. So we've got a
Mm-hmm.
question here from Paul. We're going to lean a little bit more into the forestry realm here for this one. So Paul says much of the Northeast U.S. was clear cut about 100 years ago, give or take, right? So is the U.S. doing better on forest management now than when we were back then?
That's a great question. I am not a forester. I will say Rosemary Muzica, who is our new Director of Science and Research, she started about a year ago as the Director of Science and Research at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. She is a forester, and she could probably answer that question for you. My experience with North America is very limited. Like I said, most of my work is in Southeast Asia. I know that at Powder Mill, they're doing some work looking at kind of forest regeneration in certain areas, so that the area that Powder Mill sits in has parts that had previously been deforested, some parts that have
Well, I'm not sure what happened here. If the problem is on my end or your end, Jen. But, uh, sorry if I started talking over you.
no, I think on my screen you froze, so I apologize.
Okay, and on my screen you froze too. So,
Oh,
um, but I'm sure that I'll have to ask about getting some of that forestry expertise in here for a future Café Sci. That'll
yeah.
be a really good one. So we've got a couple more coming in, and don't forget, everyone, you've got the Q&A box there at the bottom of your Zoom window if you have a question. So another one from Kitty Mama: how did you come to the Natural History Museum, and how do you divide your time between the museum and your field work in Borneo?
Yeah, so the job became available in, I think it was 2016 or 17. I'm like losing track of time now. I started in 2018, and I know that I interviewed. So it must have been 2017, like, and it was probably February that it was advertised. I remember that I interviewed in March and April, and then I was offered the job in June. And so I had previously been, so usually when you get a PhD, you do what they call postdoctoral research. So I had 3 different postdoctoral positions, one in Singapore, one in Alabama, and one at the Museum of North Carolina. And then I got a job as a professor at a small liberal arts college in Singapore. And I think it was the, I tell people frequently, so our previous director was Eric Dorfman. We just hired a new director, Gretchen Baker, who is a wonderful person that I actually know from our days overlapping at the Field Museum. And so Eric Dorfman, he himself was an ecologist, and he hired a lot of ecologists into these curator roles. And so there's a number of new curators or newish curators at the Museum of Natural History who are ecologists. And I really think it was that kind of helped me get that job. And I also jokingly say that, like, when I interviewed in person, I had like done my research on who I was meeting with. And one thing I noticed about Eric Dorfman and like looking him up was that he had made a video, like a documentary type video about this New Zealand pigeon with Kiri Te Kanawa, who is a famous opera singer. And I only know Kiri Te Kanawa because like my best friend from college was obsessed with her. And so when I met Eric, that was the first thing I asked him about. I said, I have to ask you, Eric, did you get to meet Kiri Te Kanawa? And he said, I sang with her. And I was like, oh my God. And I'm convinced that it's because I brought up Kiri Te Kanawa, plus I was an ecologist, that Eric was like, let's hire this lady. So that's how I came to this job. And how I divide my time. So my job by definition is 50% research and curation, and basically 50% service and outreach. And so currently, because of the shutdown, I don't get out to the field as much as I would like. In the time that I've been here, I've gone back to Borneo twice, once each year for about a month or so. I'm hoping to start going back more regularly and for longer periods of time. Previously, I would go every summer for 3 or 4 months and collect a bunch of data and then analyze the data. So I'm hoping to get back into something like that, where I'm going into Borneo every year, or at least every other year for several months.
Excellent. Uh, so yeah, I love the story. That's fantastic. And uh, yeah, it's hard for me to keep track of all of the scientists that live in the natural history realm of the museums over here. So I didn't realize you were still so new in our museum family.
Yeah,
So that's
yeah,
good to
just a
know.
couple
Wonderful.
years.
So we've got a question here from Clifford. So Clifford says it's good for students to come in contact, but how do you make sure you don't pick up a poisonous one? And then there's a question of frog versus toad. And I'll
Awesome.
let you interpret what that one means because I know that
I
can.
love it. I get this all the time. So frogs, the best way to think of it is all toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. So toad is a specific classification of frogs. So any four-limbed tailless amphibian is a frog, and some of those are toads. Toads, as you may know, they tend to have drier skin. That's not always the case, but it tends to be true. They tend to secrete toxins more than the other groups of frogs. And there's lots of different ways that they can be distinguished, but those are kind of the main ways that like the lay person would like look at them. With poisonous frogs, so the nice thing is people always ask me in Southeast Asia, if there are poisonous frogs, and there are, there's none quite as poisonous as the most toxic ones that you would get in Central and South America. So the ones that are in Southeast Asia, if you were to pick up one of the poisonous frogs and you had a cut on your hand, it would sting, but it's not going to kill you. And so when people ask me about it, I just say, don't put it in your mouth. And even if you did, it wouldn't kill you. It just would taste bad. So it's fine. And again, this is another really nice thing about working in Southeast Asia is there's just not a lot of things that are going to kill you out there, and it feels very safe. My mom was convinced I was going to get eaten by a tiger until I told her there are no tigers in Borneo. And so she like worries a lot, but yeah, so I can safely get students to handle those frogs out there because there isn't really any frog that is poisonous enough to do them any harm.
Great. Uh, so we have a question from, I'm not sure if it's Kristen or Christine, so hopefully I'll say your name correctly, but are there cases of invasive frog species?
Yes. So one of the most famous cases of that in the US is called the cane toad. So I did my master's in Miami, and these cane toads are everywhere. So the cane toad is native to South America, and through various means, they've basically been exported to many places on the planet. And they're famously invasive across Australia, for example. So if you've ever been to Australia, you probably see like cane toad coin purses, and like they basically like kill them as much as they can and try to like sell them, but they wreak havoc on things. And one of the reasons that they're so invasive is because they tend to outcompete the native species, and they do that in a lot of different ways, both at the larval stage and the adult stage. One really interesting piece of research came from, so cane toads were introduced on the east coast of Australia, and people have been able to track that expansion across Australia. And what recently people have shown was that the cane toads at sort of the forefront of that expansion, they have longer legs than the other ones sort of like back at the origin, which means that they're like evolving to like expand, meaning expand their range. So there's lots of really interesting work. That's the main one that I know about. I'm trying to think if I know of any other examples of invasive frogs. I think that's really the only one that I know of offhand. But again, it's similar in Florida and other parts of like the southern US, that they're just really invasive.
If I'm not mistaken, I think the bullfrog that we're familiar with here is invasive
Oh,
in certain parts of the world too.
thank you. I can't believe I like forgot that one. So in Southeast Asia, the bullfrog is very invasive. And so this is true because they are used as, they're grown like commercially for food. So people in Southeast Asia eat a lot of frog, and so they have these sort of like pens of bullfrogs, and these bullfrogs then tend to escape. In most places, they don't tend to invade then primary forest, which is good, but they do tend to outcompete things that are in developed areas. So in Singapore, you get them. So I lived in Singapore for many, many years, and you will see bullfrogs like in town parks and things, but there's not many species left in those town parks that are like native. Most of the frog species are in kind of like the remaining central catchment, or the remaining like primary-ish forest in Singapore.
Okay. So a related question here from Clifford is: do you work with both frogs and toads?
I do. So I'm a community ecologist, which means that I don't work on any one particular species. I look at overall sort of diversity and abundance, which means that on the streams where I work, there are both frogs and toads. I love both of them. I love to tell people there's one site that I go to sometimes. The biggest toad I've ever seen was about this big. So it was like the size of my forearm. So I held it against my forearm just to prove it. And I held it like a baby. They get enormous, this one particular species. And I love taking students out to this particular place because you can always find like a giant one there. And there's lots of really cool toads out there as well. There's really tiny ones with skinny limbs. And they have like these really beautiful calls. There's a tree toad, which is really incredible. So that one has kind of moist skin. They live in trees. They've got big fat toe pads and they've got this beautiful face. And the females are kind of a beigey brown and the males are like black with orange stripes, so to speak. It's kind of like a marbling. So there's lots of really cool toads out there as well as great frogs.
Awesome. John, we're going to get to your question in just a moment, but we've apparently opened up the floodgates about toads right now, and so I'll keep the toad train rolling. Bill once saw a toad walking on all fours instead of hopping
Yes.
and wonders if that's common behavior.
It is, or it can be. So I'm trying to think of, there's several. Yeah, so one of my favorite frogs, people always ask me what my favorite frog is, and the short answer is I can never pick just one. But one of the ones that I love is a toad in the genus called Pelophrine, and they're a tiny little toad. They occur mostly at high elevations. So in Borneo, there's a mountain called Mount Kinabalu. It's about 4,000 meters, which is the highest peak in Southeast Asia. And they occur really high up. And this Pelophrine has these really skinny limbs. And like you were describing with this one you saw, it just kind of crawls along the moss and then like sticks its head in and eats the insects in the moss. And they're adorable. And I've seen, there's a handful of other frogs and toads that I've seen sometimes like crawling along. But a lot of the toads I see, the other toads, like the big fat ones, they just hop but slowly and they don't get very far because they're so heavy bodied. So it's not uncommon to see things crawling, but usually they hop.
Okay. So a question here from John is, do frogs carry diseases? I know we touched on, some poisonous things before, but are they a disease vector?
Yeah, so as a vector, the answer is not to my knowledge. So I have never heard of anyone getting a disease from a frog. They are impacted by disease. So one thing that you may have heard of is something called chytrid fungus. It's a fungus that impacts them. It basically occludes their skin, meaning because their skin is usually so permeable, they absorb both water and oxygen across that skin membrane. But when they have this chytrid fungus on them, they can't do that. And they tend to either dehydrate or suffocate or die from that skin occlusion. So to my knowledge, I've never heard of any frog being a vector for disease, but they are impacted by various diseases for sure.
Okay, we've got two related questions, both submitted by anonymous attendees, but I'm wondering if this might not be the same anonymous attendee because they're so close related. The first question is, how many edible frogs are there? And the second question is, which critters prey on frogs?
Excellent. So I assume by edible, you mean edible by humans. And the answer to that is I don't know, but basically you could probably eat any frog that doesn't have skin toxins. So I wouldn't recommend eating a toad or any buffonid because it's possible that those toxins would then get into the muscle, even though it's produced by the skin and meant to go out, not in. But in preparing it, it's possible it would impact the meat. And any of the frogs that, like other like poison dart frogs, for example. There's lots of large-bodied rhonids that produce toxins. I wouldn't eat those. So in Southeast Asia, there's a genus called Limnonectes, and some of those individuals also get very big, and people tend to eat those. It's just like kind of like giant wood frog, for example. So people eat those a lot there. Obviously, bullfrogs are really popular for eating, partly because they can grow them really fast. They keep well in captivity, and they grow really big. And so if you're growing something for meat, you want it to be large bodied to make it kind of worth your effort, right? So people tend to eat larger bodied species. As far as what eats frogs, I would say most things that are bigger than them. So there's birds will eat frogs, reptiles will eat frogs, snakes will eat frogs, small mammals. So in Southeast Asia, we have a lot of civets, which is it's a small mammal that has a long body and short legs and kind of a long snout. They eat frogs for sure. There's cats out there, sort of small to medium bodied sized cats that eat the frogs out there. Here in North America, I'm sure it's the same, that things like bobcats and lynx would probably take some frogs on occasion. Lots of birds here eat frogs. There's even, I saw one time in Borneo, this is terrifying, a spider eating a frog. And I'm not talking about a tadpole, I mean a toad. And it wasn't a big bodied toad, it was a small bodied toad, but even so, I was like, holy cow. This is a really mean spider.
Isn't nature grand?
Exactly, I love it.
I'm getting an update right now from the anonymous attendees. There are actually more than one. So sorry to confuse you both for being one individual that may or may not be a hungry frog on the other end of the keyboard there.
Exactly.
But the next logical question that followed here from one of our anonymous questioners is, do you eat frogs?
I don't. People ask me this all the time, and I always say it's because I think they would know. And then I feel like if I ate frogs, then when I'm out looking for them, they'd be like, okay, everybody, hide. She ate Bobby. Like, don't let her find you. So I've never eaten frog, even though it's very popular, like I said, in Southeast Asia. Like, there's a very common dish called, like, people call it porridge or congee. It's like a rice, like breakfast dish often. And frog porridge or frog congee is really popular. I've never had it with frog. I always have it with chicken or something else. And I've never had frog legs or anything like that because I would feel bad.
That's fair. And there's a comment here as well. The voracious nature of frogs eating whatever will fit in their mouth isn't limited to just adults. So, like, bigger tadpoles will eat smaller tadpoles, and so on.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So what those tadpoles eat depends on their mouth parts. So there's a really interesting array of mouth part types that different species of tadpoles have. Sometimes it is kind of like a standard mouth, and they will, like you said, eat other tadpoles, either of the same species or other species. They'll eat invertebrates. There's species that have their mouths kind of like at the top of their head, and it's like a filter feeding. So the tadpoles sit right at the surface of the water, and their like lips, so to speak, are kind of like right at the surface, and they just filter water into these big fat expanded lips and like get little like tiny things off the surface of the water that way. There's specialized species that are adapted to live on very, very fast flowing water. They have a big, huge ventral sucker. These tadpoles do. And so they kind of like scrape themselves along these rocks, eating like algae off of these rocks as they go. And it's fun. You can like put them on your finger and they'll kind of like suck their way up your finger. And so there's lots of different adaptations for like the ways that tadpoles feed. And so, like you said, they will eat in many cases other tadpoles, other invertebrates that are in the water. Sometimes they feed on algae off the rocks or filter feed from the surface. There's lots of different adaptations in tadpoles. It's really amazing.
That's really interesting. I did not
Mhm.
know all of those different feeding adaptations with tadpoles. So we're going to kick it back to a question here from Clifford, and then I see a couple of comments from Kitty Mama. We might be running out of steam on the Q&A, but we'll answer any questions that do come in before we say goodbye. So if you have another question or two that are lingering in your mind, feel free to put those in the Q&A box. So Clifford asks, you mentioned your work in mitigation with the effects of palm oil plantations. Is there are there any activities to decrease the production of palm oil? And that uh, might be referring to, local activities or global governments. I'm sure you can interpret that
Yeah.
in lots of different ways. Or is it more on the shoulders of the consumer to make the products containing palm oil less profitable?
This is a really good question. So to me, palm oil is just this really fascinating sort of Pandora's box because it is somehow very inexpensive to produce and also very inexpensive to purchase. So one of the reasons it's so common is because it's very inexpensive to put as an oil in your shampoo or whatever it is that you're making. At the same time, it is somehow very profitable for the people, even for smallholders. So there's obviously large corporations that produce palm oil, but even still, there are lots of, like, I have lots of Malaysian friends who have, if they have any kind of land, they will plant oil palm trees because they want to get money. And so they can grow these trees. They start fruiting within, I think, 5 years. And then the palm oil, big palm oil companies make it very easy for them to sell directly to them. So the palm oil companies will come right to your house, they will weigh it, and they will pay you cash. And so it is somehow very lucrative for some of these people to produce it and sell it at a small scale. And it's also very cheap. So the fact that it's like lucrative, but also inexpensive to buy, I don't understand the economics of it. And I've never seen like sort of the spreadsheets that would show how that is. One of the ways that I think that that does happen is that in many cases, they effectively use like, for lack of a better word, slave labor. And so in Malaysia, for example, a lot of the people that work on the large palm oil plantations, they're not Malaysians because Malaysians wouldn't work for as little as the palm oil companies are paying. And so you get a lot of people from especially Eastern Indonesia, which is a very poor part of Indonesia. And these oil palm companies recruit them, they bring them over, and it's sort of basically, again, it's not like they're bringing them over and paying them a good wage. It's that they're telling them, okay, I'm going to pay for your airfare to get here, or pay for your boat trip to get here, and then I'm going to give you a house to live in, but you have to pay us back. And so these oil palm companies have these like indentured servants basically working on these oil palm plantations. It's really amazing to me that all of the oil palm, it's not harvested mechanically, it's harvested by hand. So when you go through these oil palm plantations, you see people with these big giant, like, I don't know what it's called, but it's like a long stick with like a scythe at the end. And they cut down these palm fruits. The palm fruits grow in these big bunches. They cut them down, they load them into sacks on their back, and they like walk them out to the main road where the trucks come. And so it's all harvested by hand. So again, I don't understand how it's so cheap for us to purchase, given that it's like all harvested by hand. And again, I think the only way that that's true is because they're not paying the workers fair wages. And so the question about whether there are ways to reduce that, I think because the purchase price is so low, I don't see it being reduced anytime soon, meaning the demand for it going down anytime soon. Everyone that I know in Malaysia, like the cooking oil they use in their home, it's palm oil. If you go to a restaurant, everything is cooked in palm oil because it's so inexpensive. And so unless that demand for it goes down, or the governments decide to prioritize not cutting down forests, I don't think that that's going to happen. And in Indonesia, there's something interesting that happens, which is that the government has decided that if you're a corporation, you can't cut down forest to plant palm oil anymore. But there's no law against a smallholder cutting down forest on their own land. And so what happens is big corporations basically pay people to cut down forest so that they can buy from these smallholders. And it's just this kind of like vicious cycle. And I personally don't know of what the solution is. So that's one of the reasons why I try to choose not to just consume it at all, if I have a choice. And there's some people who would argue that the RSPO, the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, is the way to go, because one thing that was pointed out to me is if you just boycott it and don't use it, then what happens is that drives down the price, and that markets like China and India, then they will be able to buy it because the price will be so low. And because of the size of those economies, meaning there's tons of people in those places, then it's going to create even more demand. So I don't know what the right answer is. And it's a very complicated question. And I find it to be fascinating that it has this biological and also socioeconomic impact and social justice implications. But it's messy and I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of the problems with cocoa farming as
Mm-hmm.
well. So we see these things happening around the world. So yeah, and like you said, there's no easy answer, and
Yeah.
that can be really frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't see any more questions coming in. Just a couple last comments here from Kitty Mama, one of our Café Sci stalwarts. Welcome back this time. I saw your questions earlier. Saw a spider eating a frog in South America on a nature program. It was horrifying. 0 out of 10. Would not recommend. And Kitty Mama also says, "Good for you for not eating frogs. They absolutely would know. Don't know how, but they would know." So, uh, Jen, I want to thank you so much for being our speaker this evening. It's been a
Thank
wonderful
you.
privilege to host you here
Aw.
at Cafe Sci. And for those of you who uh, are here with us now, I would invite you all to come back next month, the first Monday of the month. We'll have Bonnie McGill from the Carnegie Museum of Natural History from the section of Anthropocene Studies. And so I think we'll have some more uh, discussion that is related to some of the topics that we got onto this evening. But Bonnie's going to be coming at that from a different angle. So thank you all again for being here. And Clifford, keep up the good work teaching environmental science. And
Aw.
if you have any other questions, you can find Dr. Sheridan on Carnegie Museum of Natural History's website, and you can reach out if any other questions do come up. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this session will be available on YouTube with the Q&A. So if you want to share that with anybody, that link will be coming out, and you'll find that on the Café Sci webpage very, very soon. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you, Jennifer, for being here, and we'll see you all next month. Take care.
Great. Thanks, Brad.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.